Cards. Over the years, Clash Royale has seen some goofy ass cards, and over time these good or bad cards need balancing. But sometimes they accidentally take things too far. Or was it accidental? Today, we're going to be taking a look at 7 more cards that at one point were incredibly broken, either at release or due to a buff. Now, this is one of 3 videos so far. If you want to check out the previous ones where we talked about these 14 cards, links will be down below and it'll also be at the end of the video. Anyways, enough talking, let's get right into it.
Let's do this.
Goblin Hut. You know, it's rather weird to see a building do so well in Clash Royale nowadays. Buildings had gotten massive nerfs in 2016 and 17, and after that it felt like they were shoved under the rug. Of course, not all of them became useless, but the stories of OP buildings after that period are far and few between. But in April 2020, the Goblin Hut got a rework, and for a brief period, it was pretty dang powerful, and I really wanted to talk about it because it's mostly just funny. I don't know, it's just the most random building to become meta. The rework consisted of decreasing the Goblin Hut's lifetime by 10 seconds, so it now lasted 40 instead of 50 in exchange for 3 additional goblins when destroyed. So basically, they made the building last 10 seconds less, but threw in a whole ass card in there. The hell were they thinking? The problem was that the rework felt more like a massive buff than anything else. So all of a sudden, everyone was using the Goblin Hut to defend against win conditions, and because it had so much damn HP, it did a pretty good job at that. The hut took the damage as a meat shield, and the goblins did the rest along with your towers. And the 3 goblins that spawn after was simply overkill. The Goblin Hut found its place in practically any deck that would have otherwise used a cannon or inferno tower because it was just that much better for defense, but also really good at offense with all of those goblins. We even saw the rise of spawner decks at the time. Players were pairing the Goblin Hut with barbarian huts, furnaces. It was absolute chaos. Felt like 2016 all over again. Unfortunately for the hut, the next season would basically kill the card again. 35% of its HP was taken away, and it sort of just disappeared after that, especially how all other spawners had received a similar nerf. It's like him and his buddies were sent to the gulag or something. Witch. The developers have always struggled to properly balance the Witch, and that can be seen through its very long list of balances. I mean, it's a very long page. For most of its early years in the game, it was either a bad card or way too OP. And while there are many moments in history that I can talk about, I'm going to be focusing on her October 2019 rework. Probably one of the worst card reworks in the game's history. At the time, the Witch was kinda ass. All she had going for her was the fact that she spawned quite a bit of skeletons. It was like a tombstone on wheels, or legs. And her splash radius was okay at dealing with swarms, but you were better off using something like an executioner, wizard, or bowler at the time. After a few unsuccessful balances throughout 2019, it was pretty apparent that she still sucked, and it was decided that a major overhaul was probably the better route. But no one could have imagined what was coming. On October 7th, 2019, basically every aspect of the Witch was changed. They decreased her area damage and health, increased the attack speed, completely remove the skeleton spawn at death. The skeleton spawned slower and in a different shape around the Witch. But on top of all that, the real kicker was that she now did 220% more damage than before. God damn. Basically, these balances made her similar to a musketeer that cost 1 elixir more, but could spawn skeletons, and trust me, it was certainly worth it. The Witch went from very weak hits to being able to one-shot a lot of cards like minions, dark goblins, princess, and medium-sized tanks were getting taken down in just a few short hits. She was dealing insane damage. It was absolutely unnecessary. And you know what? Around the same time, the Elixir Golem had just come out, and the Night Witch and Fisherman was OP as hell. I mean, oh man, what a time to be playing. An example of a very strong meta deck at the time was this. Mega Knight, 2 very strong witches, and an absurdly OP E-Golem. Anyways, for the first time in a while, the Witch was considered a really good card. But unfortunately for the Witch, this will come to an end soon after. I guess it was just supposed to be a Halloween thing. On November 4th, 2019, they increased her hit speed and first attack time both by 0.3 seconds. The first round of skeletons took an extra 2.5 seconds to spawn, and they completely removed her splash damage, making her a single target troop. This was a very harsh nerf. I mean, they didn't have to go that hard. It essentially killed the card. The witch would eventually get her splash damage back, as well as a host of other changes throughout the years, but nothing ever came close to how broken she was that season. Princess. Nowadays, we have the luxury of being able to counter the princess with a variety of cards and guarantee that she doesn't hit the tower or your troops at all. However, this wasn't always the case, and it's a big part of the reason why she ended up on this list. The princess was one of two of the first legendaries added to Clash Royale. At the time, her unique ability was the fact that she did splash damage at a very long range. There was nothing like the princess at the time. But players had a problem with the princess, besides having impossible odds of unlocking it. There was simply no easy way to counter her without her getting tons of value unless she was at the bridge or you had arrows. People were getting tired of it very quickly because it felt so unfair. The princess would just sit back doing tons of damage to whatever the hell she was targeting, and more often than not, there was absolutely nothing you could do about it until she got closer. There were simply not enough long-range cards or spells that could take her out, and the ones that could cost more elixir than her. On March 23rd, 2016, her hit points were reduced by 10% to help cards take her out slightly quicker, and on May 3rd, 2016, they removed a level from legendaries. It wasn't that big of a deal though with 2 legendaries at the time, and the fact that the average player did not have max legendaries, so whatever, right? The fact was, the main issue was still not addressed. And actually, it wouldn't be balance changes that would nerf the princess, it would be new cards. 2016 saw a bunch of new cards, and within those cards there were tons of counters to the princess as well, like the guards, miner, log, mega minion, dark goblin, and the list of viable counters just kept growing throughout 2017. Now, some of these counters were legendaries, which were rather hard to get in 2016, especially the log, an obvious counter choice. But at least there were more options now, and previous cards that weren't great counters were getting buffs as well. By the end of 2016, countering the princess was way easier than it was when she first came out. But man, I'll never forget just how broken and annoying she was to deal with in 2016, especially when you didn't have her yourself. Archer Queen. The Archer Queen was one of the first 3 champions added to the game, and much like when legendaries were first added, they were simply too powerful out of the box and definitely needed some nerfs. The Archer Queen quickly became the #1 used card in grand challenges at the time, and it was no surprise why. The base stats were pretty typical for a card that cost 5 elixir, kind of like a musketeer with more health and damage, but obviously with a champion it's almost always the ability and not the troop itself. In the case of the Archer Queen, for just 1 elixir more, it shot 3 times faster while invisible for 3.5 seconds. Basically, during those 3.5 seconds, no troops could target her, and she could freely deal way more damage to whatever she targeted. It wasn't even about the invisibility sometimes, it was all that extra damage. At 200% faster attack speed, she could basically shred through most cards in the game, including shutting down balloons, tanks, before they ever made it to the tower. Also, entire pushes. It was a lot of value that she definitely didn't need. And because the ability cooldown was only 11 seconds, it was pretty common to see the ability popped more than twice during a deployment. Just 1 week after launch on November 4th, 2021, they were already nerfing the Archer Queen. Her cooldown was now 15 seconds instead of 11, and the ability lasts slightly less at 3 seconds instead of 3.5. But these changes didn't have a massive impact, and she was still considered to be the best card in the game for the next couple of months. However, shortly after, she would receive more nerfs. Her movement speed during the ability went from medium to slow, the attack speed buff from 200% to 180%, and even in 2023, almost 2 years later, still getting nerfed. It wouldn't be until recently where she got her first ever buff, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, she seems to be doing just okay in the meta nowadays. Little Prince. Released on November 6, 2023, it was immediately available for free to everyone above Arena 11. And while that may seem like a fantastic move on Supercell's part for free-to-play players, it opened the door to one of the most stagnant and boring metas in Clash Royale history. Well, at least in my opinion. See, the Little Prince was a free champion, so even if it was a mediocre card, players were still going to use it because it might be the only champion they have, and champions are unique and have cool abilities. But the fact was that the Little Prince did not suck. It turned out to be very OP, and now everyone had their hands on it. For 3 Elixir, the Little Prince was basically like a musketeer, but better. But its attacks ramped up the longer it's locked onto something, so right off the bat, without taking a look at the ability or anything else, it was a pretty decent card that could easily replace something like the Musketeer for 1 Elixir less and be way better. It could even survive a Fireball, something that cards at 3 Elixir don't, not even the Musketeer at 4 Elixir. But the main issue wasn't the Prince himself, of course, it was the Guardian that spawned from its ability. For only 3 Elixir more, you could spawn a whole ass medium tank with similar stats to a Knight that dashed 5 tiles, hitting anything in its way, and pushed everything back 3.5 tiles. It was absolutely busted. It was as if the Guardian was a result of the Bandit, Knight, and Log having a threesome. Don't even ask. To put its base damage output into perspective, the Little Prince could counter a Golem before it ever touched the tower, and still remain with half of the HP on both units, which was enough to make a pretty decent counter push. The Little Prince and Guardian could easily counter any push out there, and it was so easy to use and learn. Not only was it incredibly OP though, but it also had some unfair bugs, like if you cloned it before the Little Prince died and activated the ability, it would spawn a full HP Guardian as the clone. Yeah. That ain't supposed to happen. Or the fact that it could take out a goblin drill underground before it ever had a chance to see sunlight. Now, I think anybody could have expected nerfs will be coming, and just a week after its release, the Guardian's dash decreased by 10%. So instead of dashing 5 tiles, it now dashed 4.5. However, this nerf was kind of useless outside of a few specific interactions, so it really didn't matter. On November 17th, the Guardian's pushback was decreased from 3.5 to 2.5 tiles, so finally a nerf that made a difference. They also slightly increased the number of hits the Little Prince would do before ramping up. So the first few hits stayed the exact same, but since it needed more hits to ramp up, it would end up doing less damage over time. That's also something that was OP, but I think that was pretty obvious. It would also receive one final nerf on January 3rd, 2024, decreasing the Guardian's health by 11% and the Little Prince's damage by 9%. The card still remains a good choice even after all these nerfs, but it's definitely not as broken as it was 2 months ago, and thank God. That meta was so boring it had me playing way more Clash of Clans. Mirror. The mirror has been in the game since its beta launch, and it has a very long history of balance changes. But today, we're taking a look at OP cards, a status that the mirror wouldn't really achieve until April 2022. The mirror mirrors your last played card for 1 Elixir more. The level of that mirror card will end up being the level of the mirror plus 1. So you can go an extra level higher than the max if your mirror is maxed. It's been like this for the majority of the card's life, and overall, it's worked just fine. But on April 4th, 2022, an unexpected buff to the mirror allowed it to spawn cards the same level as the mirror, plus 2 levels. So with a max level mirror, you can now spawn cards 2 levels higher than the max. At the time, the max level was 14, so you could spawn cards that were level 16, which was wild to say the least. This made up for a very interesting meta. All of a sudden, everyone was playing mirror in any deck, even coming up with new strategies like Earthquake Cycle. What the hell even is that one? Why am I not surprised? It also didn't help that at the time you could cycle mirrored cards faster by playing a champion because it would not mirror the champion but the previously played card. This will be changed later, but it wouldn't have a huge impact on the mirror meta. One of the strategies where the mirror was becoming a bit of a problem was decks that utilized a recently reworked and buffed Electro Giant. The Mirror Electro Giant cycle meta, which consisted of just dropping and mirroring the Electro Giant as much as possible, was certainly one of the worst and most broken metas to be playing in. I mean, any OP meta is kind of annoying and boring, but this one was just so goddamn boring. There was no skill required for it, and unfortunately this would go on for 2 whole seasons. After an Electro Giant nerf though, the mirror would find its place in the meta alongside the Giant Skeleton in August 2022. But instead of nerfing what seemed like OP cards that were getting mirrored, it was beginning to feel that maybe the problem was the mirror and not the cards that it was mirroring. It was ultimately decided to revert the changes that had been put in place in April of that year. So now the mirror only adds 1 level. This would mark the end for the very surprising mirror meta. Evolved Knight. Evolutions so far have been notoriously OP at release, and while an argument can be made that they have to be powerful to make them worth it, sometimes this is taken to the extreme, like the Evolved Knight. In the season of August 2023, this evolution was first available, and it quickly became apparent just how much better it was than the regular Knight. Like all the other evolutions, it has some significant boosts to the base stats. It did 10% more damage, plus 33% hit speed, and 30% more HP. The damage and hit speed boost alone meant that it was doing 45% more damage per second, which was the equivalent of a Knight 3 or 4 levels higher. All of a sudden, the Knight was way more tankier and hit pretty hard. If you ignored an evolved Knight on your tower, it was guaranteed to take that tower down, but obviously no one is that dumb. On top of that was its special ability. As long as the evolved Knight was moving, moving his legs like every other troop does in the game, it received 80% less damage. That 80% damage negation was wild, and there was absolutely no reason to make it that high on top of all the other stat boosts. Also, because the Knight has always been a trusty card to carry in almost any deck, it was a no-brainer to obtain and utilize the evolution. It could now counter way more cards than it couldn't before and lead to some busted-ass interactions. On August 24, 2023, the Knight's evolution received its first nerf, reducing that damage reduction from 80% to 60%, which is a very big jump, but it surprisingly didn't do that much of a difference in high-level gameplay. But yeah, it was necessary anyways. Before the nerf, the Evo Knight showed up in 70% of all top 200 decks, which is incredibly high. The Knight would also receive more nerfs. On October 3rd, 2023, they decreased the stat HP boost from 30% to 20%, and just 2 weeks later decreasing its attack speed by 18%. All of the changes basically made it way easier to counter, of course. Swarms were already effective against it, but now even more. Today, the Evolved Knight has a pretty healthy usage rate. It's in the top 3 right now for grand challenges, but that's mostly due to the card just being good with or without the evolution. So despite all of the nerfs, it isn't going anywhere, but at least its evolved state is not broken anymore, at least in my opinion. So guys, that's pretty much it for these 7 cards that were broken at some point or another. These are always fun to make. I love researching the goofy nature of Clash Royale balancing. It just never makes sense sometimes, but still fun to talk about. But I believe this is it for a while until Clash Royale has more whoopsie daisies, which probably honestly wouldn't be that long, but yeah, don't expect another episode anytime soon. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching. Havoc Gaming out. Peace!